Hey, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about color. First, I'll show you how I set up my palette, and then we'll talk about 3 ways to use the watercolor. Things I call growing a wash, charging in, and edge pulling. So let's talk about the colors. This is my palette, one of my portable palettes. So what I have here is a split complementary setup. So that means the complementary colors, red, yellow, and blue, and there's 2 of each. And they're split into warm and cool versions of each. So we have a warm and cool blue, warm and cool yellow, warm and cool red, reversed in this case. And they're also light and dark. So you can mix the complementaries to make the secondary colors. So yellow and red make orange, and blue and yellow make green. So with this setup, I can basically mix any color that I need to. So that covers the whole basis. And that's what you're going to find in most travel kits. That's split complementary. But I also have some darks down the side here. So there's 3 darks. This is essentially a dark brown red, dark green, very almost blackish green, and a blackish blue. And then this is black itself. These are my neutral tints. So all my color mixing is going to be making a hue with these primary and secondary colors. But then I like to neutralize everything. I always work towards these darks. So my rule of thumb is never to try to paint purely with any one color. I'm always going to be mixing 2 together, and usually complements. Typically, like for flesh tone, I might use this alizarin crimson as a base and the cerulean blue. That's a warm and cool together, but then I'll gray it off a little bit. And so you'll see as I go how I'm working with that. But this is one of the palettes I use, but often on location, I'm actually working smaller. So that's my little palette. So this guy has all the same colors, and oddly, there's actually more color spots in this little compact one. So I also have 2 violets, a light and dark violet. And the way I use this on location is I'll have a sketchbook, and I'll actually clip it right to the sketchbook, just like I did with my little ink container. So when I'm on location, I'm working with a brush, and I have everything I need right there. I'll have my little bottle of water, and that's my basic painting kit. So I can walk around and follow the model and paint the action. So, and if there's one thing to talk about with color that I want to leave you with, the one thing that most people are going to be doing wrong when they're mixing color is they're going to use too much water. Even without seeing your paintings, I can probably say that's your first mistake. I did it for years. The paintings come out too pale. You want as much pigment to get a juicy mix. So when you put the color down, you get lots of intense color. So that's the one tip to take away from color mixing. And let's dive into it. So here's our ink drawing, ready for color. What I actually did, this is the one from before, but I've redrawn it on this watercolor paper. And these are the actual boards that I'll take on location. I use a little heavier paper for the watercolor. So it'll take the ink, and I just tape it down. It's dry paper. I don't pre-stretch it. You might certainly have seen watercolorists that soak the paper and stretch the soaked paper, but I work wet on dry, because it's just like you would do in your sketchbook. And for me, these big boards are my sketchbook I take on location. So I'm going to do the washes right onto this drawing, just like you'll do with yours. I have a little bottle of water. I just use these small ones. The idea with the small bottle of water is I can hold it in my hand with my sketchbook. And as it gets dirty, I carry extra 2 or 3 of these. So when the water gets cloudy, I can just switch out the little bottles. That's how I manage my water supply on location. And one other thing I'll mention is this little spray bottle. So I carry this little guy to just mist the palette before I get started, just to get the paint, just to wake it up. You know, I want to be able to release color quickly. So that's the first step to get ready to go. So what am I thinking about with this is those tasks I'm going to do, growing the washes and charging in color. The reason behind that is so that our watercolor washes they have interesting variety, shapes inside there, little tints of color inside the main tone. But there's going to be a dominant tone in each big area. So her shirt, her skin, and her hair are the 3 big areas. And the beauty of tinting is the drawing does all the work for you, and you're just adding the color. All the fine detail is already there, and to some extent, the tones of the shadows. So it's just a matter of washing in color. So let's give it a go. Let's see. So like I said, with my mixing color, I know that's basically a green, but there is a kind of a bluish tint. So I'm always thinking, what 2 colors are going to give me my base? And that's always a little bit of 2 colors. And I don't want to blend them together endlessly so they become a monotonous mass. I like to have a little puddle with two colors going on in it. And then as I work, I'm going to be constantly balancing, switching back and forth the proportions of these two colors and maybe adding in some other ones. So we'll see what I come up with. You have to be a little spontaneous as you go. So this is going to be making a basic shape. And what I'm trying to do is reinforce the shadow shapes that I have in the drawing. Like I know that her torso is one mass, but I also have these, this sense of the wrinkles in the fabric. So I'm always building on what went before, using the anchors, little clues, what I had down. And I'm, again, making these open strokes. You'll see that it's very similar to what I used to do, or what I have been doing with the pen and ink, that you're moving in an open way around the form, not closing the shapes, not being worried even if I go outside of the form a bit. So this shape, when I say growing, the idea is that even if I tint colors into this shape, I'm stitching it into this one central mass. It stays wet at the same time. There's a little bit of shirt back there, a little sleeve in the corner. So it's one shape that I'm connecting everything up to. That's what I mean by growing. So when I add a color to it, it's still one unit. As long as this is wet, I can do this thing that's called charging in. So when I add a color, I'm going to go back into my palette. In this case, I'm grabbing a burnt sienna. When I touch that into the existing wash, it's going to, that one did a little bit better. It's going to naturally blend with what's there. That one color blends into another. So that's what I meant by charging in. So you have the growing the wash and the charging in happening at the same time. You know, all these little tasks overlap. Some of the drawing is just like an ink drawing, using the number 10 brush again to make some fine lines. And then I'll just show you what I mean by edge pulling. When you have a shape, you can use just clear water and pull out that shape. So you'll see how the water causes it to bloom, causes it to grow from one reservoir of pigment that you've left on the page. So I'll do that again a couple times, but that's the three different tasks that I'm intermingling together. And again, like I said, I think I said before, it's not like painting a house. You're not trying to get even coverage. You're actually trying to get these little things happening where the color is blending naturally. You want to let the watercolor do some things for you, happen by accident. So I want to charge a little spot of color into that so it'll just join with what's there. And you have to work reasonably fast. So I tend to do this one color block and then I'll move on to the next one. Sometimes you want the blocks to touch so one color will flow into the other. But generally you're okay if you keep your areas of color separate, but work them fast enough that you can get some of that flowing action. So when I put in a base skin tone here, this is just this piece of wash. If I go back and charge some color now, that's just going to flow into that wet area. Paper towel is always a useful painting tool. See how it's just flowing inside that shape, but it's not leaving the wet area? That's really what I mean by charging in. When you lay in that color, it's moving on its own, but it stays inside the zone that you've created for it. That natural mix is not something that you can do by shading. It's just going to happen automatically. It's a property of the water, and that's what we love about watercolor. It's got that spontaneity. So let's see, an alizarin, a little bit of an alizarin crimson base. You get just a warm tone. I'm going to just lay that into the face. Carry it all the way down, and I'm leaving a few glints of white behind. Sometimes I'll take the extra liquid out of the brush so that I can go back with a relatively dry brush and adjust. That's a version of edge pulling right there, actually. This edge here I maybe want to soften. A little bit of moist pigment or moist water just softened that edge out. I could probably do that over here. A little bit of moist water just softens that edge, pulls it across, just to make a nice smoother base tone. And I've left some little glints, almost random glints of light, because this is the base, and I'm going to come back again with a second pass, which is going to be shadow shapes. Charging in a little red there. Often I'll like to use a little, oh, oops, that's pretty intense. I'll often, actually, I'm going to leave most of that. I'll leave I like a little bit of more intense color along the extremities. The hands, sometimes you'll see there's these little dots of color on elbows and at the base of a neck where the bones hit the skin, these clavicles. And I can see from the way I've inked it, I've told myself, this is where the tone is in my ink drawing. I've given myself a clue as to where I want to catch those accents. So there is that charging in to a base tone happening. Whatever I paint down is going to move a little bit on its own, but I'm good with that. You may have heard watercolorists say happy accident. I kind of like to think of it as controlled accident. It's happening in the place you want it to happen. See how that red mingled in? And it's hardly even noticeable there, so I might restate it, let it do it again. So that's the three things that I think about happening together. Let's keep going, get some hair. This is just a simple base tone in here, just laid in her hair. And I'll switch up a brush and take some of this, just like I did with the hatching. I've painted the figure and then made this tone that comes out of the figure. I'll do that with a wash as well. And so I have a burnt sienna in here, so I'm going to the opposite, which is blue, to make that neutralizing effect. It's always the warm and cool together. I almost don't even care what color I use, as long as I have the value right. So I know I want a gray, so I'm using these darks and putting them together in different proportions. So there's a cooler gray, but I go back to my puddle, warm it up a bit. So just the same two colors. Like I said, I'm always thinking like, how am I going to use these two colors in different proportions? But then pulling that out with clear water just to make a transition. So what am I doing here? I'm just softening the figure into the environment, so it feels like it's stitched in there a bit. And I'm thinking a bit about some edges, like where that book is. So the paper towel is actually on the materials list as an important tool. Softening that edge. Occasionally I will do some splatter just to add some life to a scene, and you can really, there's nothing to that. It's just a gimmick, and then I remove the ones that I don't like. I edit them a bit. So that's kind of a lively wash, and it's just breaking up the figure. And that's my first pass. I still have these shadow shapes in here. Particularly, I made this design in her head where it's divided into the two planes. So what I would do now is I would let this dry. Sometimes I work on two drawings at once, so I can start on another drawing while I'm waiting. But then I'm going to come back after it's dry and get to the shadow shapes. Okay, we're back, and I've given her a little time to dry. So the reason you want to wait for it to dry is because we're going to get into shadow shapes here. This is going to be all about making little shapes and pulling the edges. So you want control over what is wet and what is dry. It's going to pull towards the water. So I'll get into that. In the field, I have a couple ways to get it dry in between. I mean, the easiest is to work on more than one painting at a time. So you let one sit while you're working on the other. Or you just put it in a patch of sunlight, take a break, and it'll dry really quickly. Or in the winter, I've been known to find a washroom and use the hand dryer. But, okay, so let's get into her. So this is, when I said you want juicier paint, this is the time to get richer paint. So I've got a red and yellow thing to get some orange going here. Maybe I'll tint a little brown in that. So we're going to go into those shadow areas that we've mapped out before. Around the eyes, under the bangs, under the nose there. And whenever I place something down, I'm going to think about how I'm pulling it out with the water. Go towards gray a bit with that. So I know there's a cast shadow under the lip, a little bit in there. So I'll put that shape in and then go with a damp brush that I've cleaned off. Clean the brush. Sometimes I flick the water out of the brush in location. So it's just damp but not soaking, and just pull that shape out, kind of redrawing that little piece I put down. So you're using a little bit richer paint this time because you're covering that first wash that went down before. And I don't worry too much about what people are going to ask, and please do ask your questions on the platform. You're going to ask what color I use, but you know, I don't even worry as long as the value is right. The individual colors matter less to me than the lightness or darkness of the color. Well, that's a little too dark on her chin there, so I'm going to lift that. Tissue is always an important tool. I just know I want some warms in here, in her ear, and a little more emphasis there on the eye. So that's this process of placing and then pulling. I talked about the edge pull. It's a way of drawing with water. And I made those little brush strokes with the pen, and here I am making those same brush strokes again with the watercolor. I'll put a shape in there and just pull it along this edge. So it's only going to go where the water is. The paper is dry, so it won't migrate just anywhere. It'll only go into the wet areas. So you have, when you're working wet on dry, you have more control. A sketcher is typically, you look at a sketchbook close up. It's not like a painting that hangs on the wall. So we're interested in a lot of detail in a sketch, a lot of sharp detail. So I like that, knowing that I can control the direction that the water is going to flow. That's my thing about wet on dry. Let's reinforce that. And I talked a bit before about the paint being too weak sometimes. The more water you have in your watercolor, the lighter it's going to dry. Like you think when you put it down that it's pretty strong, but actually it lightens up on you as it dries. I like to say watercolor dries up, but by that I mean up in value. It's always going to be a little bit lighter than you thought you would put it down. So you got to be, you can be brave when you place it, because you know it's going to dry up a little in value. Those little raccoon eyes in, but I'm pulling them out. So that left that light on her nose. So that's the process. Let's do a little bit in here, re-emphasizing some of these shadow shapes. I like to sometimes say to myself, restate the darks, looking for what is the area that is the dark. On this second pass, I'm coming back in and re-emphasizing that area of darkness. Watercolor, being transparent, sometimes you need to think ahead of where I'm going to do the layering. And I'm tinting a little bit of brown, a little bit of blue in here, making this green, breaking it up so it's not a uniform color. Even though, you know, her shirt is only one color, but the artistic interpretation should have more variety than actual nature. So that's coming to a close. It's very fast. See, this business of working on location in the field, it is possible to get all the way through these steps on your subject before they're gone. Now, I admit typically you'll be watercoloring after they've left, but it's quite a rapid process, so it happens all the time. You get all the way through it. That's the best when it happens. It's the most fun. See how she's starting to look a little more interesting? These little notes just add some subconscious detail, little glints to myself, where the color isn't too uniform. I better get some in her hair. You know, I really could stop at any time here, but I'm gonna make a few more colored accents, and it's that process of put in a shape, get a damp brush, and pull the tint out a little. Just a little bit of a blue tint along to blend that shadow in. Yeah, so that's pretty much her. So a little tint in this water bottle, a little shadow here. That's the process of catching her and adding color to your sketch. So I'm going to do one more example. We're going to go back to that black dress. Okay, so remember this drawing, the black dress. We took it on in pen and ink before. So now's our chance to do it in watercolor. So I've done a second drawing on the watercolor paper. An opportunity, I said there were two ways you could go about it with solid darks. We're going to try to do that same process, but get those darks in a living watercolor wash. And it should be more interesting because we can put more color variation in. So, actually, not that big a brush over here. So let's get into this. I'm going to go right for these dark colors. Too damp. It's really the same situation that you do in ink, but when I make a black with watercolor, again, that thing I said, I'm always trying to use two colors together. And you'll remember those motions where even inside something that's going to be a silhouette, I'm thinking about capturing the form that's under the body that's inside the dress, the form that's in the inside. So I'm growing this shape, filling with those darks. And each time I go back for the color, I might tint a little bit towards the warm or the cool. I'm just picking my way around these hands here. So I would be doing, I will of course be doing the flesh tone at some point, but I really want to concentrate on the issue of this dress and how I would handle it in the watercolor. Make another dark that's mostly ultramarine blue here. A little bit of that. That's my dark blackish green. So see how that's a cooler blue? So I've got another big shape in there. And while it's wet, charge in that color variation. So it's very similar to what I did in ink. But when you're doing it in color, I don't know, I think it's just a little richer. There's a nice edge pull. Look at that smooth shape. It's somehow softer to do it in watercolor than in the ink. There are these little subtleties that are going to appear. I'll probably pull her a bit into the background even as we go here. As long as I cut this wet shape around where I want it to respect, whatever I do into that water, it'll stay in that wet shape, whatever color I inject in there. Just lives in that home shape. Edge pull that. See that nice little bloom where the two wet shapes touched? That's the part that I love about the watercolor. And it's definitely a nicer paper, makes a difference. So this is a Fabriano watercolor paper that I buy in sheets and cut down, kind of make my own books or make my own tablets of these boards. But there are plenty of nice watercolor sketchbooks out there. Moleskine makes a great one. There's a company I really love in Kansas City called Handbook. They have a thing called the Watercolor Travelogue Journal. It's a really nice watercolor book. So definitely take a look out for those. It's a paper that will stand up to this process. So see how there's so many different interesting colors here in these darks? I'm getting close to the point where I'm going to want to let it dry and come back and restate the dark again. So let me just touch her skin tones a bit before I do that, but that's how fast you can fill a shape. Really, the dark shape now is her dress, rather than the last one it was the hair. So that's 90% done. And in fact, I'll just do some little touches on her face and probably won't even touch them again. So let me just get that in. This is going to dry lighter than you think. I just put it in, but it's going to lighten. Remember I said how when you have water in your wash, it's always going to dry lighter than you think. So you got to go in with some aggressiveness. Just going to blot a little here. You always have a few seconds before the water sinks into the paper, especially in a sketchbook paper. They're what they call coated stock. So there's a little bit of time to get in and blot something, to lift some color in there. You can also use a clean brush to do a lift like that. So I've just, my most important shadow shape. I've just hit the shadow shapes of the skin. And that's all I really have to do to get the character of this woman. For me, she's been about this dress the whole time. So that's the first pass. I'm going to let that dry and we'll restate those darks. Okay, so we've given it some time to dry, and I'm just going to come back and restate the darks. It's the same mixes again, just putting them in a little stronger. Let me get some pigment out here. Now we really want to have lots of paint, very little water. And to get this kind of coverage, you're trying to get almost opacity out of your watercolors. So get it on there richer than we had before. There were some nice things in that first pass, like that little pull. So I don't want to obliterate some of those nice features, but I just want to get a little more power into some of these, into this dress. Refining that silhouette. So this is really coming to the end of that basic process. The 4 steps, we started with the pencil, inked our drawing in our pen and ink, maybe the dip pens, and brush pen to do the dark accents, and now we've tinted our drawings in watercolor. So that that's the whole basic process, this 4 steps. So at the end of this lesson, you'll have done everything that I do in my sketchbooks. It's a good time to go back to the top, go through the class material, and if you haven't done the homework, catch up, do them in order. Just a few notes. So here's a chance also to do a little bit more calligraphy, some darks. Remember I talked about breadcrumbs? You can have some of those darks standing out on top. Almost fully pigment. So there you go, restated. That'll dry down and merge with what's there before. So that's the whole sketchbooking stuff. So in our next lesson, we're going to do advanced techniques, a few other ways to use other materials on more challenging subjects, things that are fully in motion.